and welcome to Macros with Mythili, the ET show that takes a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. Well, in the run-up to the Union Budget, we've been bringing you a series of programs of the challenges and the opportunities before the Finance Minister, Nirmala Sitharaman, as she rises to present the budget, her first full budget on the 1st of February. In the first of these, we had given you a broad framework within which the budget is going to be framed. The second, we brought you the revenue side of the budget. In the third issue, we brought you the expenditure side. And today, we're going to bring to you the flavor of what, to my mind, is perhaps the single biggest sector in the economy, which perhaps if the budget were to spend on, could set the needle moving as far as growth is concerned. And joining me in discussion are two experts with deep knowledge of the infrastructure sector. Vinayak Chatterjee, Chairman, Feedback Infrastructure, and Brajeshwar Singh, career bureaucrat and former Chairman, NHAI. Welcome to the show, Vinayak, Brajeshwar. Let me start with a confession. I'm a great votary of spending on the infrastructure sector, not only because we have a crying need for infrastructure in this country, but also because I sincerely believe it has enormous externalities for growth. So the first question that comes to mind is faith in infrastructure as a driver of growth misplaced? According to the National Infrastructure Pipeline Report, infrastructure expenditure increased from 5.3% of GDP to 10% in the last 5 years. But growth has really not picked up remotely commensurately. Of course, there is some dispute about these numbers because the definition of infrastructure used in the report is wider than the Economic Survey's definition. And there are other figures which show that infrastructure spending has not really increased. But if we set that aside, my question still remains. Can infrastructure be the engine of growth? Let me start with you, Vinayak.
Well, infrastructure is well acknowledged to be the biggest engine of growth. It has the highest multipliers, not just directly in terms of demand for intermediates like steel and cement, not just for employment, but also for creating conditions in the economy, whether in transportation or in power, that makes the rest of the economy see the benefits of better infrastructure investments. So I think there is reasonable consensus across all watchers of the economic scenario, of the budget, etc., that once again it is expenditure targeted towards investment in infrastructure that should be the cornerstone of this year's budget exercise, and to achieve the ends of bringing the economy back to a virtuous cycle. I am certainly one of those who would not hesitate to advocate a 1% relaxation of the fiscal deficit, provided the money is earmarked, ring-fenced, and well used for infrastructure expenditure. And probably later on the program, if you allow me, I will come into the next stage suggestion as to how this funding for infra should be housed in a DFI for maximum impact and leverage. But let me stop here.
Oh, well, yes, that is music to my ears, Vinay, because I agree with you entirely. And I wanted to propose the same question to Brajeshwar, because Brajeshwar, if you look at advanced estimates, the gross fixed capital formation is likely to grow by just 1% this fiscal compared to 10% last year. So the same question to you. Is the answer to the growth slowdown a hike in infrastructure spending? The reason why I say this is because there are many naysayers today. Brajeshwar.
Well, my view is that infrastructure spending is not instant relief. It's more like sustained release medicine, which gives its effects over a period of time. And the reason for that is that if you want instant relief in a low growth phase, you're looking at things which boost consumer consumption directly. And spending on capital goods, intermediary goods like steel and cement, benefit the steel and cement producers. Spending on capital goods benefits the producers of construction equipment. If money goes into the hands of the construction companies, they first use it to deleverage and to reduce their debt, so there is no immediate boom on that side. You're hoping that the payments which go to the bank work in a kind of money multiplier. Your real income multiplier is coming out of the income which is going to the labor in the sector, and infrastructure will deliver enormous benefits on the supply side. But on the demand side, it's how much of the money is getting into the hands of labor and how much is labor spending. And we have a problem here because compared to something like Manrega, which puts a whole lot of money into the hands of labor and into the form of rural consumption, infrastructure spending doesn't put very much money into the hands of labor. It puts much less. And there is a problem also on the margin. Where is the labor coming from? Is it coming from this country? Is it coming from across the border? Is always a big issue in infra. And I would say that infra, therefore, it yields huge benefits on the supply side of the economy. It reduces your logistics costs, it reduces your input costs, it creates, it links up markets much better. But on the demand side, no, it probably is a sustained release kind of program. You have to be at it for a number of years. But the multiplier effects are felt much later. It's not an instant relief kind of pill.
Oh yes, that is true, but there are no instant magic solutions in any case to an economic slowdown. But Vinayak, whenever we talk of infrastructure, we tend to lump together many very diverse sectors: power, roads, railways, shipping, airlines, telecom. But the problems in each of these are quite different and also quite unique. So is it time that we focus on those sectors which perhaps give maximum bang for the buck? And if so, which are these sectors? To my mind, power, which you represent, and roads, which Budgetary represents, are perhaps the two most important sectors when you're looking in terms of impact. Vinayak?
Look, if you want a biggish bang for the buck in terms of budgetary outlays or off-budgetary outlays in infrastructure, the sectors clearly are the ones which have a direct linkage to labor employment. And I would therefore say roads and highways, rail and metro construction, and water. I won't be surprised if this year there is significantly stepped up outlay for water for two reasons. One, this is the first time that the government has reorganized infra ministries and created the Jal Shakti ministry with an all-encompassing agenda from irrigation to groundwater to retailing water. More importantly, the Prime Minister has made many public announcements that his landmark project for this 5-year term is Nal Se Jal, piped water to every household in India, to the last village and hamlet. Now, therefore, budgetary spends on these sectors is likely to be the biggest, have the biggest impact in labor, in consuming the services of labor, and therefore putting disposable income in the hands of labor. The issues in telecom and power are vastly different, and civil aviation. They are well known. In the power sector, it is largely to do with increasing efficiencies in discoms and not so much in terms of an immediate outlay. So far as telecom is concerned, it is in a different kind of financial quagmire which it has to come out of. And civil aviation, I think after the shocks of Jet Airways and others, the growth is certainly low. It is some 3 or 4% compared to a peak of 22. But there is very little that the budget can do there other than, shall we say, continuing to say that Air India will be divested. But that's an off-budgetary matter. So to summarize, I would say target expenditure on water, roads, transportation, roads and highways, water, rail and metro.
Okay, so Brajeshwar, Vinayak says that it is roads that hold the key, because if you remember, the Prime Minister's Gram Sadak Yojana during Vajpayee's tenure was often credited with keeping the wheels of the economy spinning. Apart from improving connectivity, providing employment, in fact, all the things that we're looking for right now. As a former chairman of NHAI, how do you assess the potential of the road structure to bring about the kind of change, the kind of magic that we're all looking for? I agree, there is really no magic, but in the limited circumstances that we have and the opportunities that we have, can roads really be an answer? But Brajeshwar?
Well, roads provide an enormous amount of labor, but if you were to rank the infrastructure sector in terms of how much labor are you going to employ, perhaps other forms of construction like real estate might use labor even more. And I think if you're thinking in terms of a stimulus to the economy, it would be the labor-intensive parts of infrastructure, which is the non-telecom, non-power sectors, and real estate put together, which would provide a stimulus. I think the problem with putting money in the hands of rural consumers is that you have had programs like Manrega, which have done not very much in terms of asset production. They haven't done very much for the productive capacity of the rural economy. Rural roads do help the rural economy, but they would help them much more if we were able to get rid of some of the archaic agriculture marketing rules we have, and if market forces could really penetrate into the rural areas much more powerful rather than going to regulated markets and all kinds of price controls. So yes, I'm a big supporter of the Prime Minister's Rural Roads program, but in terms of the effect of rural roads on agriculture productivity, I think the linkage has been pretty weak because there are other barriers, and those barriers are really in this form of regulated agriculture markets. We have to think about how rural roads and more freer agriculture markets can go hand in hand, and that's going to be a big step for the economy.
Yes, there are no easy solutions, as one keeps saying again and again. Vinay, but you have hands-on experience of the power sector, in fact extensive experience. Would you consider this to be one of the most problematic sectors, because we've had 3 rounds of reform, Uday being the latest, in the position of the DISCOMs is no better than before, because the fundamental reform of charging market-driven prices has really not happened. Why is power proving so problematic? Is it because of the politicization of tariffs? What has been your experience, Vinayak?
Well, it's a complicated sector, but let's take out the parts which are not complicated. The generation of power is not complicated. It is a technical issue. There is coal, there's renewable, there's hydro. There is no great issues in the generation of power. At the other end is the customer who is hungry for power. Large portions of the country still go with blackouts and load shedding, as it's popularly called. So the problem is very clearly in the middle, and the middle is the DISCOM. So our DISCOMs, most of them, are chronically sick, inefficient, and in many cases corrupt over decades of negligence of their operations. So you have, between the producer and the buyer, you have a very, very sick wholesaler. And the wholesaler does not have the power to pick up the produce, which is why our power plants are running at 58% PLF, and the country is crying for 24/7 quality power. So the entire focus has to be how to regenerate the distribution sector to provide the value it must. And in the latest round of what we are reading is that after Uday, the new scheme apparently is called Aditya, starting with Atal and going back to naming it after the ex-Prime Minister. And this is supposed to now insist that further central grants and assistance and loans and all kinds of support will happen only if there is scientific reorganization of tariffs and appointment of private sector in a PPP mode with a leaning towards input-based franchisees. Use of private sectors as franchisees to the DISCOMs to clean up the moribund distribution sector, and that seems to be the thrust. So I suspect you will get an announcement in the budget that a bold step is being taken to rejig the entire distribution sector, which is the problem child in the power sector. Now, one can go on and on about the power sector, but let me stop here.
I know, except that, we've had so many problems in the power sector, and we keep having these quote-unquote bold announcements, and nothing really much comes out of it. But I'm afraid it's time for us to slip into a very short break. Please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and I'm in discussion with 2 experts on the infrastructure sector on whether spending in the infrastructure sector in the budget could prove to be the magic wand which sends the wheel of the economy churning once again. Brigeshwar, last time we had you in your studio was when NHAI was in the thick of the storm for large overdues, but as with many things in this country, that has blown over. Not because the issue has been resolved, but because newer controversies have arisen. So what is the biggest stumbling block when it comes to road building? Is it finance, land acquisition, execution? What really is holding back NHAI from doing the very significantly good work that it had done in the past, Brigeshwar?
I think you have to look at an organization's capacity, and NHAI has to move into building up its capacity and even its manpower, and then utilizing its manpower much better. Yes, acquisition has been a big, land acquisition has been a big stumbling block. And it's been a big stumbling block not only for NHAI, but I think for the entire government-run infrastructure sector. Let's face it that today we are at a phase of the economy where really I think the focus on gross capital formation is not in the central government budget, but it's in the sum total of the states' budgets. And the states have run into exactly the same problems, that with the new land acquisition laws, they found it increasingly difficult to get land acquisition done. So this is a national issue. It faces both the state governments and the central government. It's not NHI alone which is in problems. I don't think NHI has had a problem so far of finding finances, and it's generally trimmed its programs to stay within the budgetary constraints it faces. But I think the real problem there is one of governance, one of control, and one of direction.
Okay, governance is always a problem in this country, that is true. The government had announced a 100 lakh crore investment in the last budget, but the national infra pipeline has come out only just now after a gap of more than 6 months, and it's still delightfully vague on crucial aspects. For instance, it says the centre and the states will contribute 39% each and the balance will come from the private sector. Do you see that happening? Do you see the private sector really entering infrastructure in a big way? Because they've seen it's once bitten, twice shy. Vinayak?
So, I mean, first, I think let's take a look at the 100 lakh crore figure. I've done some back of the envelope calculations. The figure itself is pretty rational, and in fact, I could argue that it is an underestimate, because if you just take the expectations of the 12th plan, the 12th plan ended on an expectation that in its terminal year, the gross capital formation in infrastructure as a percentage of GDP would touch 8%. Now, even if you apply 6.5% and 7% on our nominal GDP, you will see that the 100 lakh crore figure could be a minor underestimate, and we would be closer to a figure of 130 or 140. But let's stay with the figure of 100 lakh crores because it is a rational figure, and which means 20 lakh crores per annum is the spend. Now, this requires two things. One, remember that infrastructure projects normally have a life span of 4 years from conceptualization to completion. So to achieve 20 lakh crores of investment on the ground, you require a project pipeline of 80 lakh crores broadly. We are far, far away from an 80 lakh crore pipeline. So it's a very, very big question mark hanging over projectization. The other is about financing. The economy certainly requires 100 lakh crores, and I said that that's a rational target. But financing, again, back of the envelope calculations show that the capacity of the central government and the states put together is about 12 lakh crores out of the 20 lakh required per annum. There is a financing gap of 8 lakh crores. And I have written articles in Business Standard and I have made presentations across the board to say that there must be a clear strategy to handle this void of 8 lakh crore. And I have argued that it has to be a combination of a DFI and PPP. So broadly, 6 lakh crores from a newly created developmental financial institution and 2 lakh crores from reviving PPP through implementing measures that have been very well laid out in the Kelkar Committee report. And so far as DFI is concerned, instead of, if you have a fiscal space for 2 lakh crores in the budget coming out of asset monetization or privatization, or even by reducing the fiscal deficit, there is no point spreading this 2 lakh crores across different infrastructure sectors. Put it into a new DFI, which should have major impact on policy making also. The 2 lakh crores as equity can be leveraged minimum 9 times to raise another 18 lakh crores. So you actually have in the making, you can shape a 20 lakh crore DFI to address the infrastructure sector in a situation where neither banks nor NBFCs nor foreign investors are coming into the sector. So this is the broad thrust of the argument. Revive PPP, create a DFI. But let me get your reactions to this.
Well, let me ask Brijeshu, because I agree, I'm a votary of the DFI. Unfortunately, we in India always like to reinvent the wheel. We had DFIs, close them down, and now we're realizing how foolish that was. So Brijeshu, would you agree? And do you see the private sector re-entering, at least the road sector? In fact, we've just seen reports of the SL Group selling 2 of its roads projects to NIIF. Yes, it might be in an attempt to reduce their debt, but that's clearly only part of the reason. I think the road sector is no longer attractive to the private sector. Or am I being unduly skeptical? Brijeshu?
I think there are 2 parts of the attraction. One is that where it's an annuity project or where it's an EPC project, yes, it is attractive to the private sector. But the problem really comes on the boot portion of the cake, And BOOT projects are certainly not attractive because traffic has stagnated or grown very slowly, but generally traffic has grown far, far below the expectations of people who entered into BOOT type of projects. And BOOT projects are where you're dependent on the toll revenue for your loan and your return on equity. So expectations have not been met by BOOT projects by and large. So the private sector is very, very wary of getting into PPP projects which are toll revenue based. I think that is the thing. If there's an uptick in growth and you get higher sales of commercial vehicles, you get higher rates for commercial vehicles, if truck movement improves, yes, you would find a return of appetite for the BOOT kind of project. At the moment, it isn't there. And the reason is the slower pace of macroeconomic growth and the disappointing traffic figures.
Okay, except that I think banks should not have been lending to infrastructure to begin with, and that perhaps is part of the problem. You know, Vinayak, we've been discussing a whole lot of very high-sounding things, but the fact is that contract enforcement is a very basic tenet of commerce. But as we've seen in the case of the AP renewable power sector, the state government itself has run it on its own contracts. So what is the way out? How do we get basic ideas of commerce to start functioning in this country again?
Well, that's a broad question. I'll restrict myself to the infrastructure sector, where from the time PPP started, we have been repeatedly making the point that it's a very, very unequal playing field. PPP, public-private partnership involving the private sector in infrastructure building, assumes a stage where the government and the private investor are equal partners. And to maintain that equality, there is only one institution that can harmonize it, which is the institution of independent regulation. So there are two issues at stake which have been well laid out in the Kelkar committee report. One, the design of concession agreements have to have far better risk allocation between government and private. And secondly, you really require independent regulators to be neutral umpires of conflicts that may arise, renegotiation that may be necessitated, and judgments given when the government does not play its part or acts in an arbitrary manner, as we've been seeing across sectors. Now, unless these fundamental cornerstones are consciously placed on the foundations of a new PPP structure, you are not going to see great private sector interest, both foreign and domestic.
Oh, absolutely. There's so much that needs to be done that sometimes one really begins to despair. But Rajesh, monetizing assets built under the EPC route was expected to be a big cash cow, and that was hoped would be used to fund fresh investment. Why hasn't this worked? Or the various alternatives that we tried, the HAM, the EPC, BOT, TOT, we seem to have run through the entire alphabet soup in terms of various models of funding, tolling, etc. Why has nothing worked, Rajeshwar?
I don't agree nothing worked. I think everything works at a different time in the economic cycle. As of today, I think annuity projects, HAM and EPC projects seem to be working pretty okay, provided land has been acquired in advance. It's not the moment for BOOT projects. I agree with Vinayak that BOOT would have to come in with strong independent regulators, but when we look around the infrastructure sector, and we see telecom, the independent regulator is partially responsible for the telecom mess. The independent regulators in the power sector, which are all at the state level, and you do have a central regulatory commission also, have been very slow to permit tariff increases. So if independent regulators, say in the power sector, start favoring the consumer over the producer, or in the telecom sector start favoring A rather than B, you move away from independent regulation. And I think we have a very fundamental problem that so long as regulators are appointed by the government, will they be really independent? It's a mixed bag. Yes, conceptually an independent regulator would help, but have we seen them? Have they really helped? It's a question for further discussion and study. I'm not certain the current system is the best system. As far as monetization of assets is concerned, it's been going on in a subdued fashion, but it has been happening. I must say that the InvITs, which are the investment trusts which the private sector has been floating, have been reasonably happy. And as I see it, there will be TOT kind of auctions being done in the road sector by NHAI, but a lot of private companies will be either pooling their assets or pooling with other companies' assets and forming InvITs. And yes, there is a demand for the InvIT in the market. So as the situation evolves, I think the market always comes out with newer and newer solutions. So I'm afraid the alphabet soup you were referring to will only get thicker and thicker with more ingredients added to it.
Well, as long as it leads somewhere, that's what's really important, because when one discusses the infrastructure sector in India, it's hard not to get despondent. But it's time for us to wrap up this program. So before I finish, can I just ask you, Vinayak and Brajeshwar, that if you were to suggest some 2 or 3 things in the budget that the budget must contain, and I'm not talking about higher allocation, what would you like to see in Nirmala Sitharaman's budget on the 1st of February? Let me start with you, Vinayak.
I would recommend 3 measures to be implemented or announced in the budget. One is a 1% relaxation of the fiscal deficit, and that money earmarked as equity for a new DA5 in infra, which should target for a 20 lakh crore corpus. I would argue for a national power distribution company to provide a very strong competitive alternative to the state discoms, and we can discuss it in depth later. And excuse me, and I would argue for a very clear statement in the budget of releasing all pending dues which have accumulated to humongous levels across various statal entities. All dues to private sector suppliers of goods and services must be released on time.
Oh, absolutely. I'm sure Brajesh will agree with you. But anything that you'd like to add to that list, Brajeshwar?
I'd like to see recapitalization of the banks, because I think when you release money into the economy and it winds up in a bank account and then you're not lending again, that happy cycle of monetary policy breaks down. You don't have enough liquidity in the economy, and I'd be very keen to see something happening on the banking front. It's still too early, in my view, to call for a DFI when your banking sector is in the doldrums. But yes, I would agree with Vinayak on all those points, and particularly on the point that bills which are pending should be cleared first, and perhaps government should start clearing those bills which have employment implications, give them some priority. I'm thinking of people like the Food Corporation, whose bills affect a huge section of the economy. Maybe these people should be pushed up first to the top of the line. But I would otherwise broadly agree with Vinayak on that.
Okay, so excellent suggestions coming forth from both our experts, Vinayak as well as Brajeshwar. Thank you so much for sharing your time, taking out time and sharing your views with our viewers. I hope Nirmala Sitharaman is listening very carefully to your suggestions, because we do desperately need to see some improvement on the infrastructure front, both because we need infrastructure, as I said, and also because it could prove a huge engine of growth. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining me. Thank you also for watching. Remember, we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at TT Now.